listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon and thank you for joining us today for the CREMS webinar series. So the focus of our webinar today will be on friendship networks in adolescence and looking at some questions around how they evolve and how they influence mental health and substance use. My name's Lexine Stupinski and I'll be chairing the session today. And we'd really encourage you to ask any questions or send through any comments as we go along. So you can do that in your control panel in the questions box. So just submit any questions that you have and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Now this is the second in our series for 2016 and our program covers a range of different topics relating to the understanding, the prevention and the treatment of mental health and substance use disorders. So this year the program is going to include in August we'll have Matt Sunderland talking about assessment, so how to assess with efficiency. And he'll go through some advances in the assessment of mental and substance use disorders. And then in November, Dr. Joanne Ross will be talking about behavioural activation in the treatment of depression among substance users. So you can get the full details for these other webinars from our website, and you can also register to be involved in those webinars or to get updates about our webinar series. And if you missed any of the topics that were covered in 2015 from our website, so that's comorbidity.edu.au training webinars, you can also see information about how to watch the videos or get the handouts from any of those webinars as well. So in just a moment, I'll introduce our speaker for today. But before I do, just a quick overview for those of you joining us for the first time about who we are and what we do at CREMS. So CREMS stands for the NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in Mental Health and Substance Use. And what CREMS is all about is conducting research to improve our understanding of mental health and substance use disorders, and in particular understanding how and why these problems co-occur. And so in addition, we're working to develop improved strategies and conducting research to identify the most effective ways to prevent and treat these problems. So to achieve these aims, we work closely with services, with schools and community groups, and this webinar series is another way that we can foster these lines of communication. And this is just a photo of the team at CREMS, and you can see in the bright pink there is our director, Professor Marie Thiessen. And so now it's with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker for today, Associate Professor Tim Slade. So Tim is Associate Professor at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, and he's also Director of Epidemiology at the NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in Mental Health and Substance Use, so CREMS. His research interests centre around the diagnosis and epidemiology of alcohol and drug use disorders, mental disorders, and their comorbidity. He focuses on adolescent and young adult health and he studies the influence of individual, peer and family factors on the emergence and development of alcohol use and mental disorders. So I'd like to pass over to Tim now, who's going to talk to us about friendship networks in adolescence. Thank you very much, Tim. Welcome.
Thanks, Lexine. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about what I think is an interesting topic. It's relatively new for me, but it's something that's fascinating and I think has some real implications for how we might prevent substance use problems and mental health problems, as well as the comorbidity between the two. Let me just give you first a bit of an overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'm sort of splitting this presentation up into three sections. First, I'll talk a bit generally about adolescence and the emergence of sort of health and risky health-related behaviours and attitudes. Then I will go on to talk about social network analysis as a methodology for understanding the link between peer friendship or peer relationships or friend relationships and health. And then lastly, I will talk about some of the published research using social network analysis methodology in mental health and alcohol use, and at the same time give you a bit of a flavour for some of the work that we've been doing here at CREMS in this area. So firstly, it's just a bit of a broad introduction about adolescence and health. Adolescence marks a specific critical period of development in the human life cycle. Rapid biological, psychological, emotional and social changes occur across the adolescent period, and also adolescence is associated with the emergence and the development of risky health-related behaviours such as drug and alcohol misuse, risky sexual behaviours, unhealthy diet, physical inactivity and emotional problems such as anxiety and depression. Together, these issues account for a large proportion of the burden of disease amongst young Australians, and it's now well recognised that prevention is critical. For those of you who have participated in our webinar series before, you would have heard of some of the excellent prevention work and some of the prevention trials that I and my colleagues have been carrying out over the past few years. And we're always looking for ways of improving our prevention efforts, and one way to do this is to target key risk factors for the emergence of risky health-related behaviours. What I want to talk about today is some sort of more fundamental work looking at the dynamic developmental processes that explain the emergence of risky health-related behaviours over adolescence, and particularly about the influence that peers play in the development of these behaviours. Now, peers can mean a number of different things, but in this talk today, and most of the research that I'll be talking about and describing is about friendship, and friendship between adolescents of a relatively similar age as the defining feature of a peer. So I might be using peers and friends interchangeably throughout this presentation, and I'll also mostly focus on the emergence, the beginnings, the origins of alcohol use and the development of alcohol use over adolescence when I'm explaining some of the concepts, but most of the principles that I'm talking about and the way that social network analysis has approached these peer-related questions is the same across a number of risky health-related behaviours. Of course, the research and the outcomes can differ depending on the type of behaviour or attitude you're looking at, but lots of the principles, the foundational principles, are the same. Humans are inherently social creatures, and this is seen most clearly during the adolescent period when children transition from a family-centred environment to one in which friendships take on a unique significance, providing both social and emotional support, acceptance, some level of conformity, intimacy, and also a chance for young people to reflect. As such, the social environment has a very powerful shaping influence on the attitudes and behaviours of developing adolescents, along with the influence of parents, family, the wider community, and society more broadly. Peers play a hugely important, if not the most important, role amongst a complex set of risk and protective factors that relate to the initiation and maintenance of these kinds of health behaviours that we're talking about today. As there's also evidence that from neurodevelopmental research that shows that adolescents are particularly susceptible, more so in this developmental period than in any other, to the influencing effects of their peers. Some theories of that have been put forward to explain how and why peers influence are up here on the screen. Social learning theory suggests that people's acquisition and maintenance of behaviours depends on a complex interrelationship between individual characteristics of the person as well as the environment in which they find themselves, and these factors work via differential reinforcement. And one of the specific theories that's been put forward in the social learning theory domain that relates to drug and alcohol use is this model of deviancy training, where discussions amongst friends about antisocial or other sort of deviant attitudes or behaviours are particularly elicit a positive reinforcement from a friend, and it's this particular reinforcement across a number of exposures and occasions that leads to an increase in these kinds of deviant behaviours over time. Expectancy theories focus not only on the reinforcing effects of peers, but also on the expectations that peers have once they are interacting with their peers. And we're talking here also about positive expectancies from a particular behaviour, as well as negative expectancies from a particular behaviour that drive adolescents in particular directions. Social comparison theories hold that adolescents are inherently driven to comparing themselves with other people, and it is this comparison which drives their choice for health risk attitudes and behaviours. And social identity theory is a modification to this that involves adolescents categorising themselves and others as members of a series of groups with a shared social identity. And membership in groups come with social rewards, and so adolescents may gain access to certain groups and actually may achieve higher status in certain groups if they exhibit particular kinds of behaviours. And then lastly, peer cluster theory proposes that friendships form amongst peers that either support or discourage particular health behaviours. I don't think at this stage any particular theory dominates in this realm, but what is the evidence that peers actually have an influence? Well, as you can appreciate, the best way of examining the impact of peer use, the impact of, in the context of alcohol use, the impact of peer alcohol use on other adolescents' alcohol use is through a longitudinal investigation of adolescents' own alcohol use and how that relates to use amongst their peers. In a review of 40 prospective studies published since 1999, all but one reported positive associations between peer alcohol use at some earlier time point and adolescent use at follow-up. But peer influence, the ability for peers to influence adolescents, may not be as strong as commonly believed. More recent work has shown that influence is not the only mechanism that can explain why friends share similar alcohol and drug use behaviour, or indeed why friends might share similar levels of mental health problems like depression and anxiety. Adolescents often choose to be friends based on similarities in attitudes and behaviours, and this selection mechanism, or also called a homophily mechanism, is a strong determinant of friendship. And if we don't separate this out from peer influence, then we're truly not getting a sense of what's driving the emergence of a behaviour. So to kind of summarise there, what more recent research has tried to look at is whether influence as a mechanism is driving the emergence of a particular behaviour, and influence is where in the causal sequence the friendship comes first, and that leads to a change in substance use. When we're talking about substance use as the behaviour, it could lead to a change in mental health if we're talking about mental health as outcome of interest. So that's where an influence mechanism works. Selection, on the other hand, is where the substance use or that behaviour comes first, and that leads to a change in friendship. So here we have two potentially competing mechanisms that could explain peer similarity with regard to alcohol use or any other behaviour we wish to study. And up until fairly recently, we didn't really have the methodologies available to truly disentangle how adolescents and their peers mutually interact with each other, and how those interactions then affect their health outcomes. But with the development of social network analysis as its own branch of social science, we can now answer important questions around the origins of peer influence and selection and their relationship to adolescent health. Many of you may have heard about social network analysis in the context of a very famous study that was published by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler in the New England Journal of Medicine nearly 10 years ago now. In that study, the authors mapped the interpersonal networks of participants in the Framingham Heart Study over a period of 32 years and demonstrated that over time, obesity tends to cluster amongst those with similar social ties, and that this clustering seems to be seen to 3 degrees of separation, and hence this famous quote, "Your colleague's husband's sister can make you fat, even if you don't know her." Obviously this caused a lot of a stir in the media, and while there have been critics of this study and the approach taken to analyse the data, I think the real impact of this study and others like it has been, it's really led to a focus on social network analysis and the connections between people as a methodology to understand the dynamic interaction between social relationships and health. Social network analysis itself is both a methodology that describes the way data are collected, as well as a methodology to describe the way data are analysed. And the key difference here is that rather than just collecting information about a sample of people, say a sample of adolescents, rather than just collecting information about their own characteristics, are they male, their age, do they drink, have they had an episode of binge drinking, do they smoke, do they have a history of depression or anxiety. The key here is to ask about and take advantage of the relationships or the ties between people to shine light on some of the social processes that might be driving the emergence of these behaviours. And this is really well suited to the study of peer influence and peer selection by collecting data on the substance use attitudes, mental health, behaviours of a sample of adolescents, as well as information on the nature and the extent of friendships among that same sample, and by collecting this kind of behaviour, this kind of information across a number of different waves of data collection over a specified amount of time, we can begin to see whether adolescents choose to be friends because of similar attitudes and behaviours, or whether they in fact change their substance use behaviours depending on the characteristics of their friends, or is there some kind of interaction between both these processes going on. An added benefit here is that social network analysis is able to allow respondents to report on their own behaviour. I guess one prior methodology was asking a sample of adolescents about their behaviour, asking them to tell you who their friends are, and asking the adolescents to report on the behaviour of their friends. And it's quite well recognised now that there are limitations with that approach and some of the biases that arise when you ask adolescents to report on the specifically and particularly the substance use behaviours of their friends. There's a lot of inflation that goes on there, and so what social network analysis allows us to do is to focus on the self-reports of adolescents and then use the tie information to see how those selection and influence processes might be playing out. Perhaps the best way of showing this is through a visual depiction. On the screen here is a representation of a hypothetical adolescent friendship network. The circles represent individual adolescents, often called nodes in a network, and the blue arrows here are directional friendship nominations between, or directional friendships between adolescents. We can also depict specific characteristics of the nodes within a given network here visually, and what I've done here is just put those nodes in this particular friendship network who were drinking as red, who had reported a history of alcohol use at some defined time point in the past. As with other types of research, these networks are particularly interesting when we look at them longitudinally, and here is an example of how the network and behaviour can change over time. And I'll just try and show you with my arrow here. Some friendships begin. So for example, these two nodes here at time 1, these two adolescents weren't friends, whereas at time 2 they now have a mutually reciprocated friendship. This adolescent nominated this adolescent as a friend. This adolescent also nominated this adolescent as a friend. Other friendships dissolve. These two were friends at time 1 and no longer friends at time 2. We can also see that some adolescents hold particular places within the network and have particular central positions within a network. For example, this adolescent at both time points seems to act as a bridge between this part of the network and this part of the network. These might be two separate peer groups, and this adolescent in the middle here is acting as a sort of a go-between between those two peer groups. We can also see that there are particular adolescents who aren't very connected. With the dissolution of this friendship, this adolescent now becomes isolated within the whole adolescent network. And all of these sort of characteristics, endogenous characteristics that you can calculate, as you can imagine, are important when we're looking at the flow of behaviours and attitudes over time. And the characteristics might the characteristics that we focus on in our analysis might differ depending on whether we're looking at a substance use type outcome where central adolescents and those who have high popularity might be particularly important, versus if we're looking at the impact of network characteristics on the experience of depression, where those potentially on the edges of a network and what are often called in the social network analysis language isolates in a network are people that we might want to particularly focus on. We can also then use these visual depictions here to show exactly what we mean when we're looking for evidence of the influence mechanism. So these two adolescents were dissimilar with regards to their alcohol use at time one, yet were friends. And over time, they became similar in terms of their alcohol use and maintained their friendship. And this is one, not the only, but it's one example of evidence for an influence mechanism. Here we assume that the adolescent at time one who was drinking potentially influenced the adolescent who wasn't. Over time, that adolescent who wasn't drinking then started drinking. And again, we can isolate particular adolescents to see whether there is evidence of a selection effect. And again, here, in this hypothetical network, these highlighted adolescents were similar at time one with respect to their alcohol use, yet were not, did not nominate each other as friends. Over time, they did, and thus this is evidence that alcohol use preceded their friendship, which provides us with some evidence that a selection effect was going on. Those might be, some of the important effects that are of interest to us in the research world, and can really give us some information about where we might go in terms of our prevention efforts. I'll talk about that a bit later. But they're not the only kinds of relationships that can occur, particularly in adolescent friendships. And the beauty of social network analysis is that it allows us to look at these selection and influence mechanisms also in the context of other common adolescent relationships. For example, reciprocity is a very common process that occurs through adolescent friendships. So reciprocity, or the tendency for me to say that I am friends with you if you've said you are friends with me, is very commonly observed in adolescent friendships. Also transitivity, or the tendency for me to become friends with the friends of my friends. That's also a very common effect that we see in adolescent networks. And what we essentially want to do is remove these common effects so that we can then get a true or a more unique understanding of, or more independent understanding of whether selection and influence are at play. So with this in mind, I actually wanted to do a poll here, and I thought it would be interesting to see how many people think that adolescent alcohol use is driven more by peer influence and how many think it is driven more by peer selection. So I have a question here: on a scale of 1 to 5, how much is adolescent alcohol use driven by influence versus selection? If you think it's more or totally driven by influence, then type in a 1. If you think it's totally driven by selection processes, type in a 5. And if you think it's sort of equally driven by influence and selection, then more than happy for you to put in a 3 there. So if we could start that poll, that would be great. Thanks. While we are waiting for those results, I guess what I want to say, and this could impact on how you vote, but as you can probably all imagine, it is not as easy as being able to remove every single effect and then say it's all just one effect. As with many facets of human interaction, it's not as black and white and as simple as these pictures depict. I guess what I was showing you in those pictures was, you know, the relationship just between two adolescents. Influence will necessarily arise from those adolescents that one selects as friends, and so as you can probably imagine, both influence and selection processes are probably occurring reciprocally and dynamically to explain the coevolution of friendship networks and behaviour. So
most people have filled that out, so I've just closed the poll now. Thanks, Tim.
That's all right.
And in terms of the results, so most people seem to think that it was more driven by influence, or so 43% said somewhat more driven by influence, and then there are about 43% that just didn't want to say either way, so equally driven by influence and selection. But so overall, okay, more on the influence side.
Okay, more on the influence side. Thanks, Maxine. That's really interesting. What I want to do now, I guess, is tell you about some of the research that's come out using social network analysis in mental health and alcohol use in particular. And as most of you have recognised, both influence and selection, at least in regards to alcohol use, both influence and selection are important. But the real, the vital point here is that these mechanisms have been shown to be important independent of the other. So it's totally, a possible situation where both influence and selection can explain the spread of a particular behaviour. But what we are able to show and how this has impacts on our prevention is that both of these are particularly important. There is some debate in the alcohol use literature, social network analysis literature, about the developmental timing. If we know developmentally when influence might be important, assuming that both are important, the next step and what people have looked at is whether influence is important at certain developmental stages. But as I just said, that there is debate about this. Some studies have shown that influence seems to emerge early in adolescence. So we're talking here around year 6, year 7, early high school, with selection happening later on, although another study published around the same time showed the exact opposite, with selection emerging early and influence seeming to be more important as these kids got into sort of middle high school and later high school. Now, these are US studies and European studies. We don't have equivalent research here in Australia, and I'll talk a bit about what we're trying to do to fill that gap here in Australia. It's in a minute, sorry. It's also important to understand that the mechanisms depend on a number of characteristics, including the nature of the friendship. There is a recent study showing that selection seems to be important in new friendships. So adolescents will choose to become friends with people they haven't been friends with before based on similarities around alcohol use behaviour, but they don't continue to be friends. According to this study, they don't continue to be friends with people they've been friends with in the past based on those alcohol use behaviour. Alcohol use doesn't seem to have any impact on whether people, adolescents, continue to be friends with each other, just about how they start new friendships. And the sort of discussion around this is that it's tied up a lot to do with the context of alcohol use and how in adolescence it's often around a party situation, and where there are, quite often people that become new friends in new party situations, and that's so it's also about the context and the nature of the friendship. There's also about reciprocation. There's also research about reciprocation in friendships, which don't seem to have that much of an impact in alcohol use as they do for other behaviours, such as mental health, which I'll get to in a minute. But having said that, there is some research, which I haven't put up here on the screen, which shows that popularity, as measured by the number of friendship nominations a particular person gets, can interact with influence mechanisms to drive an increase in alcohol use over time. It's also the case that personality factors and other individual difference factors can have an impact. Self-control as a personality characteristic seems to have a protective effect. Is protective against the influencing effects of peers, and can buffer against the influencing effect. With regards to mental health, depression is also subject to both selection and influence effects. Again, the nature of the friendship here seems to matter quite a lot, and we see that friendship closeness is important because influence seems to be occurs most often with best friend dyads or best friend relationships. And much of the literature with regards to mental health and depression and anxiety in particular has used this notion of co-rumination as a potential explanation for the influencing effects of our peers on the development of mental health, depression and anxiety over time. And really, co-rumination is this tendency for excessive discussion around problems and emotions, and it's a tricky and complex issue because this notion of co-rumination seems to simultaneously strengthen particular friendships, but at the same time can exacerbate mental health problems. So there are also other network mechanisms going on, including withdrawal and rejection and deselection of friendships that are particularly characteristic of the development of depression and anxiety. It's quite a complex area, and a little bit more complex than what's going on in the sort of substance use field. With that in mind, what I wanted to just sort of talk about in the last little while is some work that we've been doing in an NHMRC funded cluster RCT of a universal program to prevent substance use, anxiety and depression across over 6,000 kids in Australia. We have, in the second wave of data, in the second of 7 waves of data collection, we asked a subset of the adolescents to nominate and provide us with the names of 3 of their best friends that they spent the most amount of time with in the past 6 months, under the assumption that those friends that they spend the most amount of time with are the ones that are potentially have the most influence on them. And data we used to map the friendship network within each of the schools where we asked this question. And here's what the network looks like for just one school. As you can probably appreciate, there aren't connections between adolescents, there aren't connections among adolescents between schools. So the way of coping with this and the way of analysing this is to look within each school and see how the networks look within each school. And if you seem to get common relationships across a number of schools, then you've got sort of more confidence in your findings. Here I've left the those who have reported alcohol use, I've left those adolescents as red in this particular network. We also asked the same questions of the same adolescents at the next wave of data collection 6 months later, and here what I've done is put these two networks side by side, and the one on the right looks messier because I've kept the nodes in the same location as they were at the baseline measurement. But as you can see, what those lines are all over the place really mean that there's lots of changes in friendship nominations, as you can probably imagine, even within a 6-month period. Lots of similarities and consistencies, but also a lot of changes. And those are the kinds of things that you need for a social network analysis. We can see really interesting dynamic network mechanisms at play here, and here what I've done is just focused on two adolescents who seem on the face of it to show an influence effect. These two adolescents were friends at baseline measurement, with one of them drinking, the other one not. Over time, 6 months later, the second adolescent is drinking, which is sort of evidence of influence mechanism going on. What we're hoping to do is collect more data, and we have collected more data to map these networks over 6-month periods, and we will be analysing this in the coming months, so watch this space. Why is this important? I think the assumption that peers, at least in the drug and alcohol world, which is where at the moment I have most knowledge, the assumption that peers are central to adolescent drug and alcohol use is reflected in the social influence paradigm that underlies many of our drug prevention programs. But prevention may actually perform better if we can target those programs to the specific social forces at play during adolescent development. Yes, influence appears important, but selection is also important. So if influence comes out as the most important mechanism, then yes, continuing to focus on peer pressure and alcohol refusal skills training and those kinds of components of prevention programs are important. But if selection mechanisms are at play, and it seems that they are, at least with past research, then we need to think about prevention strategies that potentially reorganise friendship networks. One of the most exciting areas of new development in the social network analysis area is the potential for these analyses and methodologies to identify key players or key influences in a friendship network. But then what that does is beg the question, can we actually, or should we even, rewire a network to enhance prosocial and potentially decrease antisocial behaviour in peer groups of adolescents? And if we do, how exactly would we do that? And I just put a word of warning here because there has been a little bit of intervention research that's tried to do this kind of thing, and there is some evidence to suggest that targeting peers and talking to peers in particular contexts can lead to an increase in drug and alcohol. So I think we do need to take care, but we have some strategies around how we might work with peer groups and who we might target and how we might work with them to dynamically understand and leverage them for changes in behaviour. So just in conclusion, I hope I've shown you here today that adolescent substance use and mental health predicts friendships, but also is influenced by those friendships. And really what we're trying to do is understand, and what we're hoping to do in the future is understand the conditions under which selection and influence exert their effect, which will allow us for a more nuanced and sensitive prevention approach, I believe. So just a few acknowledgements just wanted to show you our team again, directed by Professor Marie Thiessen, and just to highlight up here in the corner, Matt Sunderland, who will be doing the next seminar. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim, for giving up your time. It's great to have insights at such a high level on this topic, and such an interesting introduction to a really new topic, I guess, in terms of how we might learn from social networks, in terms of, well, particularly informing things like prevention approaches. I wondered though, as you were talking, and so just to mention, if anyone has any questions, please do shoot them through in the question box. Tim will have some time to answer some questions today. But while you're sending in your questions, I had a question, which was just about, what do you see in terms of the potential to use this in other settings relating to drug and alcohol use? So one thing that occurred to me as you were talking was recovery from treatment, and how people might be better able, for example, to recover from particular drug and alcohol use by deselecting. You had your dislike button there, Facebook button, so deselecting friendships, and whether that might lead to a better recovery. Do you see the potential of this kind of analysis to be applied in other settings like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is already some research around looking at the sort of risks for relapse and what might happen after treatment, and the importance of social networks, and particularly social support, and the kind of support that you do get from the people around you in aiding that recovery process. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a few questions coming through, and I guess some of these sort of relate to the study that you talked about, so the CSC study. So you might be able to, can you tell us a little bit more about that study and about maybe some of the findings that came out of it?
Sure. Well, the study itself is a sort of Australia's largest, I think at this stage, prevention trial, and what we're trying to do is look at a combined prevention program that targets both drug and alcohol misuse as well as mental health, and see whether sort of providing programs across all of those particular areas might do better than any one area, or than what kids are receiving just in standard education, drug education or mental health education in their classrooms. So the main aim of that project is to look at, the prevention outcomes, but what we're trying to do in particular in this social network sort of analysis sub-study is to see how the behaviours themselves emerge, how they develop over time, and there has been very little work looking at how substance use and mental health interact across the adolescent period, and whether characteristics of one might be either protective of the other, or might even feed into the development of the other, and how all of that exists in sort of an interpersonal peer-related context. We're hoping to look at whether not only do the programs themselves have an impact on our standard outcomes, like drinking rates or binge drinking, or our scales of depression and anxiety that we typically include in these kinds of programs, like the K10 and that kind of thing. We want to see whether some of these programs might actually have an impact on the network structure, and whether, for example, does the mental health program itself lead to a more integrated peer network for someone who might have been quite high in depression the outset. They participate in the mental health program, and then they have a more integration, a more integrated position within a peer network. That's sort of one hypothesis and one question amongst a number of things that we're trying to look at in the context of the CSC study.
Okay, and someone has asked whether you have or whether you've been able to take into account parental influence when you look at those networks.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because that obviously parents are the other big sources of influence across those early and middle adolescent periods. And we haven't in this study, I mean, in my mind, the ideal research study would be able to collect information on adolescents, their friends, their siblings and their parents. Exactly. And together look at how those interact. There is some, really recent research that shows that parental attitudes might be working not only from a target adolescent's own parents, but also from the parents of an adolescent's friends. So there's some sort of indirect evidence that attitudes around drug and alcohol use might be coming through from other sources of influence, and one of those could be the parents of an adolescent's friends. So, we're looking at a complex sort of interaction of factors here that we won't know about unless we can sort of measure them all. But, that's an ambitious sort of project.
Yes, I imagine these models get very complex very quickly once you start taking all those things into account.
Absolutely.
Okay, now a few people have asked about, so this project was specifically looking at alcohol use, is that right?
Yeah.
So are there plans to look at other substances is one question that's come through, and also I've also got someone interested in any differences that might emerge about the influence selection factors for different substances, so differences between substances.
Yeah, we are collecting information on cannabis use and other illicit drug use as part of the CSC program, because the prevention program that kids receive focuses not only on alcohol but also on cannabis. And there has been a little bit of work. Some of the similar findings as we see in alcohol use seem to be at play with cannabis use. But again, these are studies that have been conducted in the US, and we really need to know how these things play out in Australian adolescents to be able to come up with some good recommendations for potentially effective prevention approaches. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. So someone's asked whether there's any research that you know of into protective or personality factors that might affect who's vulnerable to influence versus selection processes.
That's a really good question, and I touched on a bit of research in my talk that looked at personality characteristics like self-control in terms of being able as being protective of influence effects. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else. Although in the mental health field, characteristics around emotion regulation or individual differences in emotion regulation, I believe might have sort of protective effects in terms of the development or the influencing effect of peers on mental health, depression and anxiety.
Yeah, it's a good question, perhaps a PhD topic.
Exactly.
Okay, and another, I think, very interesting question here, got great questions today, about the ethnicity of students and whether that was examined, so looking at belonging to particular cultural groups and how that might relate.
Yeah, and once again, a lot of the research has come out of the US, where there is actually a big focus on ethnicity and the differences among different ethnic groups, particularly in sort of drinking. Again, I'll talk a bit more about the drug and alcohol field here, in drinking, attitudes and norms and behaviours, and that, yes, there seems to be a bit of difference in whether influence or selection is at play, but we don't have a lot of information, if any at all, here in Australia. So again, we really need to do this kind of stuff here.
Okay. Now, one question here is, when you've, I guess, moving to what do we do about this, once you've identified key players and their networks with others, so their strong networks with others. Oh, sorry, the opposite to that though, what did you find out about those that were isolated in a network? So for those people, was substance use tending to be more prevalent for those that were isolated, or more for those that were connected?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that we really want to explore with the CSC data. We have some hypotheses around changes in friendship networks, particularly amongst people who do become more isolated in a friendship network, and then whether that might speed up the transition to drinking or the transition to risky or binge drinking. That's certainly something that we want to look at in the CSC data. I believe there isn't anything out there on that at this stage. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen that literature there, but certainly something we'd like to look at, and whether then the mental health program itself can buffer against some of those sort of withdrawal effects that people withdrawing from networks, friendship networks, and then taking up risky health-related behaviours like drinking and illicit drug use. We certainly want to look at some of those hypotheses with the CSC data.
Okay, great. And we've got time to squeeze in one quick last question. So now this audience member has noticed that in the baseline, when we had the baseline moving to the later time point, that in the baseline data there's a clustering of alcohol use within groups already then, and is asking, what would you attribute that clustering to at that point?
So maybe if it's possible for me to go back in my... So we see here those 4 networks, I'm assuming we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges with network analysis, I mean, it's the same with any kind of longitudinal research. You have to start somewhere. So you have to start from some kind of baseline. And we had already had some drinking behaviour in this particular network. The nodes are placed on this particular graph according to a mathematical formula that is too complicated for me to understand, but it's related to their kind of centrality. So nodes that are more in the middle of a particular network have a higher level of this notion of centrality. So it may be that those nodes are particularly central, and if that says something about drinking and the importance of drinking in being central in a network, then it could be something to do with that. We also notice here an association between drinking and popularity, particularly in this node here. This guy was drinking at this particular time point. He has a lot of friendship nominations coming in to him. So that sort of confirms what we often see in these sort of, in the substance use field, is that drinking is quite often, and it probably doesn't surprise you, associated with popularity.
Yeah, okay. So it's one of those, I guess it's one of those cases, like you were saying, you have to start somewhere. So we've kind of been talking quite a bit today about the ideal data set where everything is measured and you've got all the parent info and all the school info and you've got this massive data set. And I guess maybe this person's question is indicating that, well, do you think the ideal starting point is even earlier than we have in this data? Maybe you start tracking their friendships from primary school where there's very little chance of use, and then continue all the way up until the end of adolescence.
Yeah, absolutely, and that would be good. Those early stages can be more about understanding friendship formations and you know, what starts friendships and what ends friendships before these kinds of drinking behaviours are emerging. And then we move on to the sort of health behaviour measurement. Yeah, that's probably a good methodology for a study. Thanks.
So someone can fund us to do that. Okay, well, thank you so much, Tim, for your time. Thank you to everyone who's participated in the webinar today and for writing in your excellent questions. And if we haven't managed to cover everything, I think there were a few that we didn't get to, so please feel free to email those questions through to me, and I can pass them on to Tim. And now we will be putting up the handouts from today on the website, and the session has also been recorded, so if you wanted to re-watch the highlights from today, you'll be able to do so on the video. So thanks again, Tim, and thanks for everyone coming along, and we hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be in August with Dr. Matt Sunderland. All right, thank you everyone, and good afternoon.
Thanks.